something I always say is like, it's so established that we stretch our bodies, but the voice is the body. When do you stretch your voice? We've had some crazy conversations.
Yeah.
Just like, how long has it been? It's been about 4-ish years, like online. And but I just feel like every time I talk to you, there's like a extra like 2 or 3 chambers that open.
Oh, yeah.
So obviously doing a lot of different conversations, like it's always been a pleasure. So it's amazing to be here and talk semi-publicly.
Cheers. Well, disregarding the kind words, I totally agree with you on us always having the additional chambers, but that are always sort of like the hanging thing that then we pick up on the next one. Let's start with your original background, because I think it matters for everywhere we go. And so the keywords that I'll give you are chess, what you brought up in the presentation around your relationship with computers vis-a-vis chess, and beatboxing.
Yeah, I mean, for those and the many out there that don't know me, I've had such a strange path into kind of the fine art and like tech space and research. And just primarily like I come from what I call, and sort of the people I grew up with, like an underclass background. And that term that we use is just like both my parents were on sort of benefits, which is like welfare equivalent like here. Both neurodivergent, and just they absolutely did their best, my parents, but the environment and the kind of, there was no routine, and it was a difficult for many, many reasons. And even when I was like at school and things like that, you have like working class, but then I lived on like basically 2 different council estates after my family kind of got divorced. But my father, creativity was always his sort of temple, right? And that's something that I saw. And just, I think when you have an environment like that, I think to be able to draw or think, or you start to create this kind of, find the things where the sort of dopamine hits. And as a neurodivergent person, like the voice just was escape for me, like from a very young age. And I grew up around a lot of the kind of harder electronic music that was coming out of London, like a little bit later on, like early dubstep and techno, drum and bass, jungle. And even though I played a certain number of instruments when I was like very young, I started to sort of channel that into my voice. So when I was playing these instruments, my mum couldn't afford to actually rent them. So normally if you were like playing the drums or the trumpet or violin, you could take it home. So the real sort of touch point of why I started to explore voice a little bit more technically is I realized that if I had a sort of drum routine that I was supposed to learn, I could actually speak it. And I remember this week where I arrived at a recital and I hadn't had a chance to physically rehearse, but because I was speaking what I learned, I played really well. So that was the seed, and that started me on this journey of beatboxing. But I actually, because it's pre-YouTube, pre-reference, like I didn't have any references. It was just this kind of intuitive interest in the fact that anything I can get my hands on, whether it was drawing or something that I could use that no one could take away from me, I couldn't lose it, I couldn't lose my voice, that this spark happened. And it's this strange mix of factors. When I started getting exposed to London electronic music, I started to channel it into that. And there was something in my disposition. And at the time, I had no idea that it would completely sort of change my life. And I would take it to such like kind of obsessive levels. But I started to channel that sort of darker side of electronic music into my style. And within beatbox culture, I toured globally, had over 100 million views for the performance pieces, and I was really embraced by the producer and like electronic scene, like in London and Europe, which is very strange for quote unquote a beatboxer, because people normally associate that with like copying a hip hop track, kind of a light beat, where my influences were more like Aphex Twin and Venetian snares and Marla, who's a pioneer of like early dubstep. So when I arrived on the scene, one of the first things I did was actually get to the World Championships in 2009, and there were just, the entire world culture was like, what the hell is this? There are a lot of like, say like in Indonesia, I'd never heard dubstep at the time, and it just led to this kind of small explosion. So in beatbox, that was kind of the constellation, but the precursor to that, as you mentioned, was actually tournament chess. So even though I had this, I'm full of like contradictions, by the way. So even though I had this kind of underclass context, my father also taught me chess from quite a young age. And it was another thing that I could sort of lean into, something that felt like something that was kind of like mine. And by taking to it, I played a lot, started to play in more tournaments. I got to like a county level, but a lot of my peers at the time were like middle class, upper class. They had coaches, they had support. And it was literally 20 years ago for Christmas, my father bought me a Kasparov chess engine, which is like a physical like chess engine, chess computer that you could play with. So this simple system for something that I was passionate about never got tired of playing me. Like I could train, I could practice with it, and it led me winning tournaments. And it was this kind of infinite resource, and that really stuck with me. And I think as a vocalist, as a musician, when I moved a little bit away from touring and wanted to explore more things, in 2016, 17, when I started to get access to the first opportunities with AI, I just had this warm approach, because I just made the connection to kind of game theory and being supported by a system which is so old hat. Like if you play competitive like chess, the concept of an engine sort of training, practicing, learning from. So I took those sentiments like forward with me, and this sort of strange combination of obsessive voice practice, what is the technical kind of upper end of what a voice can achieve, and really embracing technology. It all came from that sort of foundation, which to this day it's not a traditional kind of setup to move into this world.
And it also strikes me, I mean, you even said Kasparov engine, and Kasparov famously is embroiled in the history of AI in this flashpoint for AI, and thinking about the way that chess for a long time was held up as a thing that only humans could do. Like a computer could never do chess the way a human could do it. And then of course in the late 90s, it did. And so then thinking about this Kasparov engine that you're playing, where it's like this tireless machine style machine, you know, I don't know. There's something that rises up. There's a there for me, like in thinking about that.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like law in the sense that you get these court cases that like adjust, because law is an attempt at an objective system, right, of justice. Not that it is, but these cases kind of open up a new way of thinking or a new approach. And I think game theory is such a bastion for predicting trends that will kind of emerge into these systems as they're now permeating a lot of other cultures, a lot of other spaces. So that sort of case where Kasparov placed Deep Blue, the kind of zeitgeist at that time had those sentiments that human beings are capable of X, Y, Z, machines think X, Y, Z, therefore this is, human beings have this kind of upper hand, there's these notions of creativity and vision and nuance, and the ones and zeros just couldn't compare. So when Kasparov eventually lost to Deep Blue, there was this kind of popping of that kind of archetypal approach to what humans are capable of. And that's kind of repeated in different ways over the last 20 years, notably, which many people know, was the AlphaGo DeepMind example. And it's really, really interesting just to kind of think about. I think it's game 3, move 37. This move where there was an established theory in Go for a certain sort of position, how it's played, and AlphaGo kind of ideated this move that the entire Go community, when they saw it, almost smirked, like as a metaphor. They thought this was a ridiculous move. But as the game progressed, it became clear that this was actually a new idea in Go, and this kind of mutational, genuine sort of visionary move by this remarkable machine. Not only did it lead to like winning the game, the kind of, again, the zeitgeist approach to the game itself was updated. Like the human beings took from that idea and sort of, it was, they behold this thing happening. And I think that's what's just really, really exciting, is the human ego is being popped, right? This idea that humans own intelligence, and these game theory case studies again and again and again just move towards this entropy that like we don't actually get to have ownership over what intelligence is and define what machines are capable of. It's a very sort of different system, and that terrifies a lot of people. But for some reason, there are certain artists and myself that just find that incredibly fascinating. And this notion that we've spoken about lots of times, and it's a little bit of a buzz term, but this concept of augmented intelligence, I think is really important. So Magnus Carlsen, who is currently the strongest chess player, arguably the greatest player that's ever lived, genius mind. When he sits down at a chessboard, yes, there is no sort of smart system with him. He's not referencing an AI like in real time, but huge amounts of training and practice and ideation, like with these systems. He is a kind of a centaurian mind. He's a centaur. There is influence of machine-based thinking in his human play. So I think it's just not as binary anymore. And these archetypes are slowly falling away. And as they are, there's like windows for new ideas to emerge, new forms of partnerships, new kind of notions of what intelligence is. And I just think that's really, really exciting. And I guess in my work, I try to take those sentiments of open, kind of non-ego based exploration that does happen in game theory a lot, and apply it to the arts, and primarily applying it to my own voice. Like that's really, really central to how I approach this space.
On that subject, before we get to the AI part, it never had really, I had never considered, like I knew that there was this difference in the beatboxing approach between, you know, grossly put, Europe and the US, that you kind of mentioned about like hip hop versus techno. It strikes me that those are genres that are very machine inflected, particularly techno. Do you feel like, and as you said, jungle, drum and bass, dubstep, these are genres that are already sort of associated with more of like a machine logic to music. Do you think that your experience kind of crafting your voice in that vein readied you for your AI work?
No, it's a great observation, because like, I mean, people always confuse when I say I've never really been a big hip hop head. Like I have huge admiration, and people think, oh, well, beatbox is hip hop, but voice predates everything. Like this idea of experimenting with voice and sound making, and it's really, really rooted. But I was always drawn to a machine aesthetic musically, and this is obviously predating like notions of AI or anything like that. And there was just this kind of perfect storm of why I've lent so in, and why it sort of suited my style. But artists like Aphex Twin, and the more kind of, not everyone likes this term, but like IDM, but the more experimental side of electronic music, you kind of listen to it. And artists like Ortega, where they're thinking about code in the generation of music, they're just naturally, you can say there's an aesthetic of what you would expect from generative, like kind of creativity. And a lot of the sort of more creative music generative tools that are out there, or more bespoke tools, do have this kind of quality. So it's an interesting thing of just what is an aesthetic quality, and like what is the actual technology itself, and when should we sort of have an expectation of a tech, like, oh, AI should kind of glitch a little bit and have this kind of robotic voice. And I think the aesthetics came first. I guess it's similar to, say, science fiction, right? Science fiction, a lot of the concepts, a lot of the theory predates the technology actually existing, but it's almost like a bit of a prophecy, like towards something. So those artists that were, I've always been attracted to healthy novelty. Like when I would hear something and I would think, I don't think I've ever heard anything quite like that. Like that's always been a driver for me, for not for this thing of like has to be the world's first all the time. This is the world's first AI thing, or it's just more like there's something in my like bones that I just feel some relief when I feel like something new's happening. It's like, terrible school teacher. I remember in an art class saying like, Harry, everything's been done. And there was just some visceral reaction in me. I'm like, no, like there has to be, like, in this complex universe, more art to be made. And I think that it's artists like that, these pioneers that were exploring outside of traditional aesthetics and thinking conceptually, like, and now with computation, there really is new things happening. And I think the aesthetic conversation about digital is very complex. But I'm interested in that.
As another follow-up to that, for folks who maybe don't, they hear kind of the names of music genres, but they're not particularly invested in either. So they wouldn't necessarily understand what this means from a different, like what's different about these genres. I don't know if this is a moment to ask you to share a little bit of your beatboxing talent, or if you want to describe it, sort of player's choice. But like, what would a difference between a more, American, hip hop style of beatboxing be versus a more European electronic style be?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what I'll share first is like, maybe I'm talking about these terms and these artists, and people have just kind of like no idea what I'm talking about, what that sounds like. Again, for my muso fans out there, like, I'm sorry to use the term IDM. It's a big debate on like whether that is an appropriate term, but it helps for now. But IDM specifically, if I was to define it, like if you think of traditional kind of radio music, like there's a lot of obviously like 4/4. You're using kind of very well trodden kind of chord progressions and aesthetic kind of range. And there tends to be a lot of repetition and a lot of like just working with the psyche's kind of path of least resistance, what leads to the kind of like pre-validated systems that everyone's like, okay, yes, this works. And even from a melodic sort of standpoint, where IDM is always interesting because aesthetically, rhythmically, like conceptually, there's this just wild exploration. So you could have like a 200 BPM like percussion. And yes, it could be like Venetian snares has these kind of, can be very, very heavy. But there are some tracks that even though there's a point when the percussion becomes so fast that it actually becomes elegant again. It's not like super intense where you're like being overwhelmed. It can almost have an ambient quality. And he particularly did a lot of a 7/4 sort of breakcore, and really trying to push like the capabilities of synths and thinking about what are these like aesthetics. And Autechre use a lot of Max MSP, and sometimes it's unpleasant. I mean, there are sort of examples where there's a meme. There's a meme at Coachella where Aphex Twin, who really pushes his live sets, like it really is avant-garde, but somehow they're absolutely huge shows. Just as a quick meme share, this girl, she must be like 18, 19, maybe from like the West Coast, just has just come out of a tent that Aphex Twin's playing, and she's like, I don't understand. It was so fast, and there was like babies crying, and like I just don't get what this artist is, like where they're coming from. So it can be very, very beautiful, but I like this idea that it's like music at the speed of thought. Like if you go to like a store and you're looking at the sky, you're thinking about what you did yesterday, you're thinking about like your partner, all of that has rhythms. Like there's a kind of flow there and there's a complexity. And I think it can sometimes follow that kind of structure where it can speed up, slow down, be open. So really thinking about like what's possible. Going back to the beatbox question, US kind of beatbox culture pioneered a lot. People that are now friends of mine, like Razel, are complete idols like in that world. And I kind of, these people that innovate, they find a technique, they find an aesthetic within this kind of voice puzzle that stands like head and shoulders. And Razel's ability to perform solo was so like kind of groundbreaking, and was some of the first viral content, like his like If Your Mother Only Knew clip where he kind of sings and does percussion at the same time, was global, like and downloaded like massively. But obviously having that huge kind of like hip hop edge in the UK, there really has been a shift to sort of the culture. And I think that's something to just really remember is like beatbox isn't really a genre. It is more of an instrument, and it can, especially these days, like takes the shape of where it comes from, like whether it's Japan, Singapore, America, or UK. It can really represent any music culture, any hundreds of variations of sounds. Genetics of individuals, where they come from, tend to do certain groups of sounds. People that speak certain languages tend to have certain like timbres and sort of aesthetics in how they perform. And all of that contributes to the hundreds of different styles that are out there now. And it really, it can be just a party trick. It can be a bit of mimicry that's on YouTube, but there's this super rich, explosive kind of experimentation now, which is really, really interesting. And it's been very funny for me because like whether I've been at like Harvard University or like UCL, like meeting phoneticians and musicologists, and I'll be like demoing some techniques or showcasing some of the others. And at first they'll be like, okay, yeah, I've heard that before. And they're like, I've never seen anything like that. And Hans Tuchku, who's a beautiful mind, who's a tenured professor of composition at Harvard, I spent quite a lot of time with. And his sentiment just was like how his job is to experiment, right? He plays instruments. He's pioneer of electronic over the last 20 years. And he's like, how did I not know about this? Like there's all of these voice practitioners, there's extended techniques, there's operatic, and there's this scene of individuals, like there's 15-year-old kids that are able to kind of make multi-tonal sort of sonics like with their voice that is so technical and so profound, but it's still kind of often the potential of voice, the anatomy of what is there is still quite unknown. And there's this strange subculture that, I'm very biased, but is really pushing. It's remarkable what some of the kids and what the culture is doing. The music and the aesthetics isn't always like amazing, but as a conglomerate entity of individuals, I think that culture is touching every single edge of what is possible with the voice, and far beyond definitely what is seen as like the current kind of upper end of vocal technique. So that was my rant on the different styles and the different possibilities. And just like people having an open mind to what that is now, what voice is now, what are the possibilities. It's kind of reset and it's a new game. And I'm in love with that.
Yeah, I'll get, TikToks or Instagram reels. And the funny thing also is sometimes it's a competition and you're the judge, but I won't know that until like 30 seconds in. I'm like, I got to send this to Harry. And then I'm like, oh, well, he's already saw it in person. But I even see a little bit of a taste of that, where like when I was younger, my visibility into beatboxing was minimal, but it really was filtered through this very narrow lens through hip hop. And I was always very impressed by it, but kind of to your point, there wasn't this easy way for information to travel and for people to prompt and inspire each other in the ways that seems to be happening. Now there's all this like educational content about how to do particular sounds. Like I think about when you were learning, like you would hear a sound you like and you just flying blind had to sort of teach yourself how to do it.
Well, the reference was the music. Like if I heard a sound, a synth, like that's what I was learning from. And like, it's basically like having a DAW, which for people that don't know is like it's like how a lot of music is made on your device. It's how you can make sort of compositions with a computer, but like with your face. And I've done shows, like I performed at Boomtown in the UK. It was like a giant fire-breathing spider as a stage where there's like 10,000 people. It's huge circular function one rig. And to this day, I'm one of the only kind of vocalists like that to do these like 1 hour solo shows. So myself and Lyndon J, who's producer, I toured all around the world with him. And we really thought about production. But what was special about that is when I'm stood at the spider at the top, like people can't see me, right? And the reason I share that is a lot of people assume that the kind of music of making music in this way is kind of like, look at me, look at the trick, like it's all human. And I think it was Ronnie Size, who's a famous like drum and bass producer, was on before me, and I just mixed out of him, and then I started. So I did this like 1 hour sequence, and I mean, literally like a couple months ago, I got stopped in the airport where someone's like, I was there at Boomtown, like I saw that set. I had no idea it was beatboxing until the very end. And that was always my goal, is like referencing production and can I make people dance, and can you actually do a show and not rely on like the novelty? Is that like achievable? Which is very tough to pull off. So one extra note is when you get on these like much bigger sound systems, when you have a huge rig, it's a bit like the difference between acoustic and electric guitar. It's a different instrument. And the ability to like, I had my eyes closed and I'm thinking of music and it's instantly coming out of my voice. And then there's like 10,000 people dancing. Like that's an aspect of beatboxing that people don't know about, or they don't think about, this instancy of thought to music to out. And then when it's working, when people are maybe at first in other shows, they could be like intrigued, or how's it being made? But then you see people start closing their eyes and they start dancing. And I think that's always been a difference for me, particularly. I'm much more interested in what is the kind of sonic experience that can be created versus like the kind of technical trickery of like, look at what's possible, what's capable. And that's something that I'm really sort of still passionate about, is that kind of showmanship. And that me doing that did influence the Europe and UK side. That's more common in the culture now, is to not do covers, to not copy. What can you create yourself? So those were just a few thoughts about the culture and styles and things like that.
So speaking of the technical aspects, at some point in the process, you encounter AI. And what's really special about your journey is the way that it weaves together, you know, your chess experience, your beatboxing experience, and your particular commitment to the voice, like the human voice, where like your thinking about AI as a nemesis was really informative for my own thinking. And so I want to kind of crack that open.
Yeah, I mean, if we, as an audience, whoever's out there, like kind of put the kind of beatboxing concept to the side now, like I stepped away from touring and performance because I just felt like there was more out there. And I'd always been quite cross-modal, like doing other practices and things like this. And after my first exhibition, I think 2014, it was a few years, a kind of spark came and I decided to kind of take a break. And it was in that break that I started to, just by chance, and the universe has been quite like this with me for some reason, I started to get inquiries from academics, and the whether in the neurological space, in the kind of linguistic space, phonetics, just about what is possible with voice. And it was when I was invited for the first time to Harvard University for a residency, I met up with CJ Carr, who's a computational artist and just wonderful human being. And some of his early experiments, he was the one that from the very start, I was able to send a data set. So I did a bunch of recordings. I gave it to him and he sent me back the very first synthetic version of myself. And it was doing these strange patterns, things that were like mostly possible, occasionally impossible. And for someone that's like spent 30,000 hours like obsessively training, their voice to kind of hear themselves for the first time, something new things happening. I just found that so inspiring, and I just had a warm response from the get-go. I just saw this as a way to explore, and I realized that the reason I stepped away from just touring and like kind of performance is because I think even though I am a musician and I found this kind of medium, I found the medium because I love to explore. I love to find new things. And that is actually to this day more of the priority of like what is possible, what are ways of me kind of cracking my own way of thinking, and just constantly trying to not develop too much of an ego or an archetype around how I think about music, how I think about voice. And getting access to technology is such an exciting way to kind of, to do that. So that started what I call this kind of lineage of like second self research, where by any means necessary, over multiple collaborations, over many years, I've been able to kind of generate or work with computation to push my expertise, and eventually being able to, through different methods, generate outputs that I wasn't capable of. To hear my voice like this kind of ghost 10 meters in front of me that I have to almost chase. It was uncomfortable to start hearing like patterns of stuff that I couldn't do. It's a strange feeling. But I love that discomfort. I love that challenge. And again, I think it's my chess background that my opponents in chess, they're collaborators. Like they're pushing me. They're not they're trying to kill me in game theory terms. But in that competitive adversarial dynamic, I am being forced into uncomfortable motivation. And in that kind of discomfort space, there's a lot of amazing things that happen just in terms of like your own potential and what you think you can achieve. So I'm just fascinated by expertise. Obviously for me, it's voice and this very sort of specific hyper specialism, but I really believe that how we get better at things and that the kind of framework for that has a kind of universal system, and the things that will apply in one sort of medium definitely apply to others. So I will seek out as many ways to make myself uncomfortable in the pursuit of getting better. And that better can mean different things at different times. So I've also been in just love with that process, and it's made me think about music in completely different ways. A lot of the audio, and this is common in the space, is like bizarre and not necessarily aesthetic or musical, but it's still fascinating. I am to this day still always interested in how these systems breathe, because in my data sets there can be breath. Sometimes it's hidden. Like how you breathe in this art form is very interesting, because you can't kind of perform and then go and then like continue. You have to find these cyclical systems of breathing in and out. And I remember the early sample R&M recordings, there would be these like breaths in, and then there would be like a 15-second like inward breath that's almost like gasping, which I wouldn't do. So it makes you question everything, makes you think about how you might breathe differently, as well as like the work that you do. And I think that cracking open, which I call an intelligent interruption, this idea that if you can intelligently interrupt yourself, not disrupt, which is to break the system, but just be challenged, it leads to an expert having new perspective. And I think that's very, very important for people that have spent 10,000 hours doing something. You have to refresh your ideas and your habits to continue to grow.
And there's a lot of ways that people talk about doing that, but it's really fascinating to think about doing that with a model that's spawning, it's refracting some aspect of you back to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have the language yet for something that is both you and not you, and which I think is a big part of why the zeitgeist struggles with these concepts. And it's so unique case to case. Like every generative output is not just dependent on the model or the structure, but the weighting and this is extremely nuanced. But in general terms, there is, I think there's something so sensitive and beautiful about it. Another example I give, I did one of the projects I did with the Mill in New York, was actually like a listening model. And I did another thing quite similar with Hans Tuchku as well, where it was a spectrogram analysis that allowed me to do a recording, and it would basically find all the transients and be able to identify whole sounds, and then create this kind of encyclopedia of all the sounds that I made, and then would find features. So there would be like, in a 4-minute clip, I realized there's like, in this specific case, there was like over 200 variations of a kick drum. And like only a machine can kind of listen to you in that way. Like, regardless of how someone might love me or be a fan, I don't think that's something that they can provide. And like, yes, you could say that's very cold and technical, but like, what a sensitivity to be able to zoom in and see those nuanced differences. And I think that's really interesting. The other thing that I think is interesting in expertise is it's very established that if for some reason you become one of the world's best at something, your pool of challenge is very small. Like being at the tip of the mountain is obviously very exciting, but it's much harder to improve. Revelatory ideas that bring you heads and shoulders against your opponents or within your craft is extremely rare. And there's a reason for that, because human beings go quite hard at things that are established. And I think it's a tennis stat that the margin between like the top 3 and the top 100 is like, it's very small. Like there's a very small percentage of that extra consistency. So what I argue is that when you transcend beyond human reference, where who are my peers, like who are the others that are in the space that are working in this way, and they're kind of like, there's a kind of ancestral kind of thing going on. These systems allow for complete revelations and insights, which I break down into 3 structures. I say that there's mentorship partnerships, there's collaborative partnerships, and the one that I think is most interesting is oppositional partnerships, with the kinds of insights or interactivities that can happen with these systems. So how we get better at things is also just, I love that sort of pursuit in my life. It gives me a lot of structure. Maybe that's a wound that I'm trying to heal or something, but I love climbing that ladder of ability. It makes me feel very, I feel purpose in that.
So what was the first moment? Like there's the moment where you, and hopefully we can get access to some of that audio so people can hear like that first, because that first RNN sound, at least the one you've played in presentations, it does sound like you, but it sounds extremely uncanny. It's sort of like those videos where it's like, this is what English sounds like to a non-English speaker. But it's like that atomized to the level of a individual person's voice. When was the first moment that it clicked for you that this oppositional partnership, like, was that something you instantly thought of because of your background, or is that something that you kind of realized as you were going?
It didn't happen right away. Like, I think I was just mostly sort of, it felt a little bit more like a painting the first time I started hearing audios, where I kind of just would step back and go like, that's interesting. Like I wouldn't say that I was immediately, I had this kind of strategy with how I was going to work with it. I just had this sort of, again, this like discomfort that kind of drives me towards things for some reason. But it was after we kept generating outputs, and then there was there was like a certain sort of moment where there was some percussion where I did a data set of like very structured rhythms, which was like, and these structured rhythms started to make these very sort of the output was much more wild. So it became things like and I just found that so interesting, because in that, all of a sudden I was like, oh, there's like new phrases, and oh, that's very fast, the way it kind of created that moment. I think I could do that. Like, I'm not sure. And that was the moment where I was like, wow, there really is like a reference point and where it gets sort of philosophically confusing, because it's like, where's that come from? Like there's an idea in there that I'm authentically interested in. And now, especially these days, I've integrated so many of the patterns that I've like mined from like latent space, and that it's kind of like, what's the ownership there? Very, very fascinating. So it was in that challenge and that it kind of started that breed of thinking. And I think there's so much in the world that is anxious about these systems, and this concept of automation and replacement and all that is extremely valid. But I think in terms of artistic, creative contributions of these systems, this idea of every person on earth having like an agent self, a second self within a specific medium that is challenging them. It's really sort of, it's not just sort of stroking their ego. It's like really projecting into some expression of themselves, which is like standing on the shoulders of what they've done before. And it's not so far ahead that it feels alien, but it's also not a repetition or regurgitory of what they're already doing. That is such a fascinating space. And that's what sparked for me, is like there can be oppositional, creative, collaborative relationships that are uncomfortable, but the most valuable. I just saw that as the most valuable part of what I was getting out of these early experiments. And to this day, that's like very much central to my work. And it is out there in some ways, but it's something that I think should be spoken about more.
I want to build on that point by also doing some quick like sort of definitions for folks. So RNN, recursive neural network, an early, I mean, not early. What the hell is early in these tech? Like it's a form of neural network that predates the transformer, which is what most people are associating with AI, with something like ChatGPT. I believe it also predates the diffusion model. Specifically, what's important there, I think, to pull out is that this is a bespoke model based on your data that other people don't have access to. So it's data that's obviously completely ethically sourced. It's your own. And secondly, the purpose is form fit to you. So you've made this point before around the difference between these large models that generalize and the bespoke models that are your second self. So I'd love to call a little bit of that in, because I think sometimes it's easy for people to fall into this trap of thinking AI is only one thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like what I've always loved about the generative qualities of RNN is just a way to explain it is almost like you could have a system that might predict the next sort of chess move, for example, where this expression of RNN is predicting the next millisecond of audio. So it's kind of like slicing and being predictive, and that leads to these super organic kind of intelligent decisions where it's not noise. I mean, the first iterations are noise, but eventually you just, a lot of the other outputs I've had, and even to this day, sometimes there's a quality in that. And to your point, there's such a difference to sitting down, crafting a data set, thinking after, especially like you've done it a few times and you're thinking about how is it listening? What is it biting onto? Why did this previous data set lead to like mostly inward breath for 10 hours? Like people talk about AI as this black box, and often it is in many ways, but in the same way that you might sit down with like a large like analog synth and you massage it, right? You're playing with the different features and the variables. When I create data sets, after having a few iterations, it feels like that. I'm trying to massage out some of the results within this kind of like latent space, like void. But the most important point is I had involvement and conversations to every single stage of that process. And there's a kind of antiquity there. There's like a craftsmanship. Like it felt very sort of, I felt this ownership over everything, where a lot of the conversations that happen now is artists are having their work stolen, data sets are unethical, and the power of it is you can steal things, and you're able to take copyrighted material, make a closed generative output, and then use that to train the model, which means that there is real fear there. But that is not to say there isn't very sort of spiritual, considered, soft craftsmanship that can happen with these systems. And I think as experts that have these huge sources of material, I love that there's the kind of age of the art of the data set, like how you create your data set, how committed you are to capturing and using your own data. It flips from the perspective of data being used by large tech companies versus your data used for yourself. Like if it's powerful for them, it can also be powerful for you. So those processes need to be spoken about. And there are artists like Mio Leclerc and Sugwen Chung that are also like very much leaning into that narrative, which I think is, you will see that more. And I do think eventually these tech companies will provide more services where they allow you to use your own data sets to train and things like that. And I wonder how that will influence the conversation.
Yeah. How are you thinking about, I mean, we're all, you know, there are so many ways in which there are ethical infringements on our lives. And of course that by attempting to participate under late capitalism, you're potentially, you know, advertently or inadvertently participating in infringement on somebody else. How are you thinking about your positionality as somebody who's really leading the charge around these bespoke, handcrafted data sets at a time when we're like in peak large model era? And so like you're speaking at Davos, you're speaking at the UN, like you're connected to people who have a lot of power. And you're working with organizations, again, that hold a lot of cultural and quite sometimes political or, you know, literal power. So yeah, what are some considerations and thoughts you're having?
Yeah, I mean, the first point of call, so this might sound like a change of gear, but like obviously as an individual artist, like over the last few years, I've done a lot more work as a director and taking on projects. And out of that has emerged some strategic thinking, and which has led to a lot of institutional kind of collaboration. Like as an individual artist, there's a lot of avant-garde, like experimentation, starting mosh pits at Reading Festival like years ago. But like I've spoken a lot now, and I just try to represent the necessity of the arts and creative technology in these spaces. So as you mentioned, like AI for Good, ITU, United Nations, I have a very strong partnership helping them find minds like yourself, artists that are really maybe living partnerships with tech today that 10 years might be very common, arguing that like artists or creative technologists more specifically, I think are one of the most powerful figures for not only representing relationships with the tech, but reaching audiences. Like I think experience and beauty has a utility where you're able to actually move beyond certain bias or certain knee-jerk reactions and communicate very, very important ideas. So that's the first point of call when I'm in these spaces, is just, am I fighting for more artists to be here? Like that's what I really care about, that. And kind of see me as a bit of this like unexpected spearhead to really respect and understand the context that I'm in, but also continue to be authentic and represent kind of different approaches with collaborating with these institutions, because there's still many global institutions that think an artist is a beret and a paintbrush, right? This concept of creativity, and artists were very, very decorative. But now the world is changing so fast. I think the true definition of creativity is the ability to find value that emerges out of these predated systems, which are now becoming slightly more obsolete, or at least there's anxiety around how we work, how we think. The World Economic Forum's work report for 2027 for the first time had creative thinking as like a key skill. It was the first time that even that word was sort of in there. So it's really important to try to push forward and bring artists in, which is something I'm doing quite a lot, like with the UN. When it comes to just collaborating and thinking about how the tech is, how I sort of support, I mean, the number one word is consent. Like I want to do partnerships and collaborations that are really sort of thinking about consent with how they're creating their data sets and how they're working. And then just what are the conversations around safety and around just helping people engage with it. Like, I think there's a bit of a delusion, like me coming from a working class, like underclass, like background. I went back to the council estate that I grew up on, and I was seeing a friend and just talking about AI as a concept. And it's so fascinating that an 11-year-old kid is using ChatGPT to ask questions and learn things that maybe like they weren't insightful. It wasn't insightful before, but the overall general knowledge, the AI literacy, is still very, very low. Like whether it's an executive, like a national ambassador, there isn't a deep understanding. So I think that these individuals like yourself and the creative technology space, the spectacle space, the beauty space, have a responsibility to come in and help raise that bar of understanding. And I think these institutions and partnering with the right tech company, you're able to achieve and do things that you would need a small village to like achieve. And if it's supporting people's understanding of the tech, then I support it. That's a kind of crash course in how I think about these things.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I feel like we're in a moment where like advocating for literacy can of course be read as a cop out in certain cases where it's like a company saying like, oh, we should be advocating for literacy, but in the background, they're, doing more shenanigans. But that doesn't mean that it's not actually true in the moment, that for the general public to be making decisions about how we relate to AI and whether or not there are ways that we can really steer AI toward being a public interest technology versus being this kind of like corporate enclosure. Like we're in the early moments where there's still some like elbow room. There's still some room to kind of like make a mess. And the fear is what happens with AI mirrors what happened with what we call Web 2.0 in thinking about social media and e-commerce and the enclosure of what was once imagined as a much wilder, weirder internet, becoming a kind of like surveillance, playground for the elites. So I really, really appreciate the points around literacy.
Yeah, I just think it's going to be very uncomfortable. Like the whole process, like this is like a higher dimensional tool, right? It really is. It doesn't
literally.
Yeah, like exactly. There are so many unknown unknowns, and you could either sit back and drink your coffee till it all emerges, or as an artist, you can lean in, and partnerships are going to be messy. Things are going to kind of be said one way, and then it's going to turn out that there isn't full understanding because there isn't sometimes full understanding of the technology itself. And it might sound contradictory, and people are welcome to sort of like challenge me like on this approach, but I just believe it's really important to try and to not create too much definition. Have your values, like have your sort of this kind of wireframe that I mentioned. I have my one, but if I feel some authentic capacity to reach new audiences or push the technology or create new structures around it, like I really believe in the artist in research role within tech companies. I think like if they're able to push it, especially for creative tools, it's like have artists in there where you're really supporting them to go as far as they possibly can. Then I think that's really exciting, but it will be messy, and there's going to be edge cases. There's the example of I had an interesting interaction with Boston Dynamics, and it was like around the similar time that is it Spot, the platform? It's like the kind of very accessible kind of robot tool, dog that they have. Some YouTuber got their hands on one and put a flamethrower on it.
I think it was Mischief.
Oh, was it Mischief?
I think it was Mischief.
Okay, yeah. I mean, they know how to get headlines.
I think it was Mischief, or they put a paintball gun on it, but either way.
No, but this is the point, is these edge cases are coming, and so far they're very entertaining. But there are going to be stories, there's going to be use cases for this that are not what they're designed for, in the same way social media wasn't potentially designed for what it's doing now. So I think to at least deepen people's interest has a greater good, because you raise AI literacy, people are able to not only make better decisions for how they interact with the tech, but also even for things like policy and voting. Like if the general planet has a better understanding of the tool, then that is good. And I mean, again, shoot me if it seems opportunistic, but I am really passionate about this tech, and I think outside of the artistic excitement, I think there's a benefit to like really leaning in and thinking about how artists can actually truly partner with these huge giants and this very sort of intimidating technology. And I'm gonna keep leaning in.
All right, duly noted. I would love, if you're willing, I would love to hear what, if you can rocket yourself back in time to your pre-AI self. What was a Reeps beatbox pre-AI versus a Reeps beatbox post-AI?
Yeah, I mean, like it's similar to how I described things before, but you'd have like a sort of, like it sounded like where I grew up. So you'd have these sort of heavy, slow, like 140-ish like ideas. So. I haven't done that in ages. So, but these kind of like heavy, kind of, you can just see a club, and it's, again, however that sounds like through that, when you have a big sound system. Like I performed at Reading Festival before Tyler the Creator on the alternative stage, and MF Doom.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a hell of a moment.
R.I.P.
Yeah, absolutely. And I in the last track, I went very hard, and just to kind of give perspective of how it can resonate, I set off all the car alarms in the area. I did like a huge sort of heavy beat, and when I stopped, it was just like everywhere, and that was like a big highlight. So those like slower, heavy like club beats, thinking like a sort of club producer, thinking like everything I was designing was kind of made for dance, and it was made for like that moment of being on stage, and being on stage was a huge parent to me. Like I didn't grow up with structure, and this strange art form, just I took to it, and it started to provide these opportunities. And when I was on stage, it was probably like the only time in my life that I just like nothing else existed. And a lot of my friends would say that my eyes like would change. Like when I went on stage, I just would go into this sort of flow state, and people might laugh, but it is very like physically demanding.
Oh, I believe it.
Like if you just think about it is like a language. Like you are thinking about this. It's almost like instead of choosing words, you're choosing sounds. But then when you're on stage and you're connecting with the audience, and there's this like feeling, it's one of the best like feelings in the world. The instancy of like music at the speed of thought. So that darkness. I mean, another highlight is I was the only beatboxer to play Bangface, which was it's a kind of a cult festival in the UK where they play mostly like very, very hard, like breakcore, gabba, experimental. But I did an hour set before Square Pusher.
Wow.
Yeah, as a beatboxer. So it's these kinds of challenges that I like really sought out. And there was this sort of club mentality, which has changed quite a bit in recent years.
Yeah. So what is it? What's the sample of the post AI?
Yeah, I mean, so like I am so grateful for like the fans that I've sort of acquired over the years, but I can't say they were all very happy about me like moving away from like club performance, because I definitely turned into like a kind of little bit more of a beard stroker. Like I'm going to search the kind of corners of what's possible. Again, I kind of referenced it earlier, but especially like with machine output, also thinking spatially, done a lot of work with ambisonics and spatial audio, kind of like what is a voice? What is music? Like John Cage is a huge like reference for me. And in the same way that I think he subverted like composition, like asking a question, like what is a composition? The fact that like just a normal sort of soundscape of a street has all of these qualities, and questioning if that is a piece of music, and the research into randomization. I'm really interested in kind of like what is a voice now, and like what is a human voice? What do we associate with voice? And now that I was so obsessed with sounding like a machine, and now machines try and sound like me, there's this kind of like middle point. And I guess like, so what are the main influences on me now? One is just like technical control. Like a lot of the stuff I did was there was like, as I said, drum and bass, jungle, dubstep, like experimentation. And I did, as I say, have these influences like IDM in the past. But there's one system which isn't really like a deep tech, but with all of the AI audio that I've generated, I could use a max MSP patch that if I made some sounds, it would then go through a source file and basically attempt to recreate what I've done from the source file. But it meant it kind of made lots of mistakes, but it had this original output. So I could start practicing in real time, but it wasn't on a grid. It was very, very chaotic. And I probably racked up about 100 hours over the pandemic of training in that way. And it started to become almost like meditation. And I guess what that sounded like would be more like this. So more like speech or conversational. So not musical, but I started to find these phrases and these like structures and these discomforts and timings that I just wouldn't have found any other way. So then I started to kind of develop this body of coming back to music, what I called like machine-inspired voice, which is kind of like the upper end of what I'm capable of. And I tried to think of it like a sort of world-class chess player, as I mentioned, like Magnus Carlsen. I don't have necessarily the system with me, but I've integrated as like a sort of centaur, a lot of phrases, a lot of things that I've directly learned from kind of machine interplay. So that might sound like I'm sat down, which is quite hard for anyone that's just listening to the audio. So there's a lot of kind of focus and control, and that's like one aesthetic, but it's now this sort of pool of influence, which is partly me, partly these projects, and it's definitely my own. Like there's not really others, and not all of that I'd say is musical, but and this is hard for people to understand. I think when you've been so obsessed with something for so long, you start just to become fascinated by the corners that aren't even necessarily about the audience, but it's fascinating for me to just feel like new things are happening. And I feel as much as I hear. Like I can't really describe what it feels like to do that.
Are you always just going straight from the dome?
So there are set compositions that I've written, but that was completely like spontaneous. But it's with a set of tokens that are like yeah, that I'm pulling up. I've written these machine-inspired voice pieces, which I see as almost like poetry, where it's this kind of I don't know if anyone else will ever be able to perform them, but it's a good challenge for the future. Almost like the Dada kind of absurdists, like writing these absurd poems where it's kind of subverting what is language, what is idea. I am really interested in this kind of avant-garde idea of like what is voice, and approaching these compositions like poetry, because I'm speaking.
Yeah.
Like I am speaking. But I enjoy the feeling of turning that on, and you don't quite know what's going to happen, but that's the instancy of it. It's so immediate. In the same way we're having a conversation now, we're able to sort of there's a flow state to this, and people sometimes forget that voice is, every human voice on earth is predispositioned to be masterful. Like the most common expertise on earth is language. We have a predisposition, and Sophie Scott, who's the director of the neurology department at UCL, who's a long-time collaborator of mine, amazing, incredible human being who you should have on your podcast one day. But she talks about conversation is one of the most complex acts in all of nature. And I just add this little note that like what we're doing now is more complex than a Miles Davis solo, like in terms of the actual mechanics and engineering of voice and the cognitive sort of systems that support conversation. It's amazing. And I think there's still so much more to explore when it comes to what's possible. I'm just currently using a lot of machine-based process to do that.
One sort of a practice note, like, you know, so you brought up Miles Davis. Like, I know that one of the things with, I think it was maybe Bitches Brew, but one of his albums, he literally was trained by a boxing trainer so that he had the respiratory capacity to do it. Did you did you have a training regimen? Because like when you're doing it, it sounds athletic to me. Like it sounds exhausting.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I didn't necessarily have a textbook. It's funny, I never really talk about this. There's a huge amount of training the diaphragm. There's certain patterns and certain exercises that really test that control. I mean, that was one of the fascinating things when I was at UCL, that they put a breath belt on me in the lab, and that monitors the movement of the diaphragm. And it was like a kind of science fiction. I just find it hilarious because it was like this kind of moment of like, it's off the charts. Like we've never seen anything like this before. But there's like, normally they showed me normal speech, and I just had these wavelengths. I mean, I can show you how I would train a little bit. So there's this one technique called the inward drag that I developed. And I would try, I won't do 10 minutes now, but I would try and do these like 10-minute sequences of something that would sound like this. So that is almost like a meditation for me. Oh my God. And it's not easy, but people can't see it, but my diaphragm is literally doing this. And another thing that people don't consider is something called equilibrium of breath. And I found these ways, obviously there's outward sounds, but then you have to find inward sounds as well, and it creates this cycle. So that inward drag technique is specifically efficient at having like equal out and equal in. But as you're doing it, you have to make these small adjustments to make sure, because you're literally feeling, am I running out of breath? Am I getting enough oxygen? Do I have too much? So you're constantly calibrating. So when you do that for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it really trains like your diaphragm. And I mean, within the community, I'm a literal tank. Like the hour sets that I did is still to this day something, as I've already mentioned. Sorry to say that twice, but it is something I'm really proud of. And people, I mean, I don't go front and center. I don't normally talk about this because it's sort of like, what do you mean? Like for beatboxing, you're doing like hardcore training. But like Lyndon J, who's one of my oldest friends, a Grammy-nominated producer, he basically describes me as like a vocal Olympian in the way that I approach it, and that's not to kind of push me up. It's more to share like how I approach.
No,
it
this
in
is
my
important
training.
context. You don't need to be.
Yeah. It's just there's so much physicality, and to keep that energy. And I mean, when I first performed High Altitude, I had to change my show because the stuff that I was doing mid sort of set, I realized, oh my God, like I have to change the music I'm doing to adjust with how much oxygen I'm taking in, because it's that is the engine, that is the fuel. And there's a lot more that I could talk about when it comes to just like power, also like breadth of frequencies, because it might not translate, but there's like high sounds. Like this is a technique I developed, which is like a vibrato hum. So what I'm doing there is actually change it. It's a hum. It's a very resonant hum. And when I touch the roof of my mouth with my tongue, it changes the path of resonance through my skull. So I'm actually like, in the same way you might like have like a sort of tin drum, and if you touch different parts, it resonates differently. Strange, right? But so there's these higher sounds. But then one of my sort of specialities has been like taking kind of direct influence from Tuvan, Mongolian, like resonance, where you're able to not only create like a low tone, but you're controlling the front of the harmonic sort of shape that's in front of it. So it's a little bit early for me. So this, I don't know if this will be perfect, but. So the reason that's a little bit deeper is because you're able to change the shape. So obviously there's like a traditional method there, but then there's this kind of more like, again, electronic approach to how you're shaping a synth. But then there's like stranger ones, which it's like multiphonics, where you're singing, but it's taken inspiration from the innovations in jazz brass playing in the 60s, where you're creating a buzz note with the lips. So you could have and which is like two notes at the same time, but then you're actually able to sort of isolate and create movement in two different directions. So that's up and down at the same time. But then I would think about sort of synths and like, again, contemporary production, and the way like you can have like multiple oscillators. So it's a interesting set of sounds. And then very, very deep ones, which don't tend to translate on camera. And this is something that, again, is mine. It's not very really sort of done in the same way, but so that probably just sounds like sort of guttural breathing to like everyone else. But there is actually like below, there's like 40 hertz in that. So when I have a microphone, a big system, that will shake the building. Like, and if I'm in a certain room, or like, especially if there's like sort of shiny surfaces, like the entire room can vibrate. So it's just fascinating to be able, as a single human being, to not obviously just create these like huge resonances out in the space, but also just like within yourself. And it is very meditative. Can I share one more thing?
Please.
Yeah. So I do sort of have these like pattern-based repetitive practices, which isn't so much about the physical training, which we've spoken about, but I have to train my mind, like to actually think about, because you have a lot of the time you have multiple systems happening at the same time. So there's like one meditation that I do where you have like a single percussive constant, like with the diaphragmatic system, which is this system. And then I'm using non-diaphragmatic, which is using the muscles in my mouth to create percussion sounds. Something I really, really enjoy about that process. So that would sound like. So I can do that for like an hour. And it's just I'm in this like this different space. And when we step away from sort of contemporary aesthetics, like chanting in voice, like ritualistic repetition, entrancement, like all of these things, like I think the voice is the original technology of intra and extra exploration. And I think if you control the voice, you don't only influence the surroundings around you, you're also influencing and controlling the body, which is very similar to the concept of breath, right? People talk about that with breath, but I think the voice is a high dimensional breath. I think there's more to it. And I think if you're, and this isn't just like general kind of alternative thinking, like you're literally pumping frequencies into your body. Frequencies have cross-modal representation on psychology, on sentiment. So if I'm talking like this and my voice is slightly higher in different frequencies versus if I'm speaking like this, I think it has a direct influence on mindset. I think where you resonate in your body can really influence your attitude towards the world. And shallow breath instigates anxiety and panic and sort of survival. Deep breath instigates safety, calmer nervous system. But I think you could also think about authentic and inauthentic voice. You can think about tensioned, stressful, muscular systems in how you speak when people are stressed. There's this tone versus when they're relaxed. Same human being. And I think we can get stuck in those. And I think we have many voices as human beings, but we can actually reset in the same way. Something I always say is like, it's so established that we stretch our bodies, but the voice is the body. When do you stretch your voice, right? This deeply intimate, profound, genius system that sits within inside yourself, which is the gateway to the outside world and the bridge to your like inner mind. And most people's general opinion on their voice is, I don't like it. I don't like my voice. And the end. And some people go their whole lives without ever thinking about the voice as a gateway to influence and design state of mind. So there was a little bit of a spiritual rant there, but I really believe in voice as gateway outside. And if I can control my voice, if I can conquer these sort of mantra-based, repetitive, difficult structures and get into a flow, I just feel most grounded as a human being. So there was physical and sort of spiritual training.
Oh, that was amazing. That was amazing. What you said about people saying, I don't like my voice, that really lands for me because I remember when I was doing my graduate studies in poetry, somebody said something that was really informative for me in thinking about how to talk about poetry with other people. Particularly, I was teaching at the time, so with students, which is a lot of people are taught poetry in this one narrow kind of like soul-sucking way of like, you're supposed to kind of go in with a magnifying glass and like, you know, find the meaning like hidden in the words, which there's obviously ways to do that that are good, but like this very like academicized version of, you know, reading Robert Frost or whatever. And they assume from that they don't like poetry. And so what my friend said to me was like, if you ask somebody like, what music do you like? They'll name plenty of different types of music. But if you actually like ran the numbers, they probably only like 2% or 5% of the music in the world. There's probably lots of other music that'd be like, that's not for me. But they wouldn't then take that as an analysis that they don't like music. And so thinking about this way that we relate to our voice, I guess the other maybe example to draw in is like, it would be like saying, I don't like basketball, but you've never actually practiced basketball to learn how to do things, to develop any type of mastery. And so it seems to me like what you surface, I think, is really profound, because like where poetry and basketball are nice to haves, they're things that if you pursue them and you like them, that's great. But if you don't have them, then, you know, life will carry on. As you pointed out, your voice is with you, short of, you know, an extenuating circumstance or some, you know, unfortunate happening, like your voice is with you, and not spending any time to live into that voice, to develop a type of mastery with that voice. Yeah. It just strikes me as like this huge missed opportunity that so many of us have.
I'm astonished by how central a voice is to everyone's life, but there is an avoidance. I think it's kind of similar to this kind of exercise. I don't know if you ever tried, but like most people, if they look themselves in the eyes in a mirror, it's an uncomfortable experience. It doesn't make any sense. You does it shouldn't. Why is this uncomfortable? And I think we're so attuned to to perceive others that there's a sensitivity there, right? But it's the same with the voice. Like people have an archetype of who they are, what they sound like. And then when they're confronted with their own voice, it's kind of like holding a mirror up to themselves, which is a very intimate, we have just a natural hypersensitivity to this medium. So there can just be an avoidance or a quietening of the self, and it really should go the other way. I think like people should just see the remarkableness in their voices, and people often think that because of my practice, like I'm interested in like these remarkable voices that are very technical, but again, it's the opposite. I think like every single voice on earth is an extremely precious and like wonderful thing, just as it is. Like just a speaking voice, like you can't separate the human condition from a voice. Like they're the one and the same. Like we come into the world screaming. Often the voice is the last thing we use before we go out the other side. And if I was to drop a laptop on my foot, the first thing that will happen is I will scream. So that there's conscious voice, but unconsciously the voice it's like this auditory part of the being that is just always there reflecting, yes, like this amazing ability of human beings to make decisions and language, but it is this sort of, it's a nerve of outwardness, like where you have nerves are there for sort of mapping out reality, but you've got this thing in you that is remarkable in so many ways. And I see it's such a shame that in a lot of modern communication there is a sort of an avoidance, and even if someone is okay or supportive of their own voice, you can go deeper into getting them to be with it and examine it, and there tends to come a point that there's a block. There's a really fascinating connection between like just the ability to shout and scream. Like if someone can't just release and open and shout, it often is because of a wound or a trauma. There's something at some point that told the soul that you shouldn't fully open up. Like you can't, it's unsafe, you'll be judged. And it goes so much, that is beyond language. And most of my work is interested in the paralanguage of voice. It's all the meaning and the purpose and the beauty that sits kind of outside of semantic meaning and like language. And yeah, those blockers and that exploration I'm very, very passionate about. And I think in my sort of later years will become the most important part of the work, is like how I've had this gift of just going completely insane with how far I push my voice, and not having any fear in that. And it's like, how can I share that with others? I think that's a really exciting prospect.
I don't know if you're considering now your later years. They'd be sort of
no. I mean, they're technically later than the previous years, but I think I've got a few sort of like notches on my belt, and there's hopefully quite a bit of space left.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, as to work you're doing now, I think this is a good moment to talk about voice gems. So I guess as a start, what are voice gems?
So alongside me practicing voice, I mentioned that I've always been quite cross-modal. My father was a visual artist, and I've been visualizing the human voice through different means for over 10 years now, which is crazy for me to say. And all that really means is, as I was performing, as I was thinking about voice, I just always had a fascination with how to see that input. And I just always believed that if you can get input, like I think one idea compositionally can exist across different modalities. And each expression is like an echo of that kind of central idea. So if I was able to sing an idea and see a visual equivalent of that, I and the audience would perceive that idea more. It's kind of like a trigger of listening or perceiving. So that started with cymatics. I just had this intuitive connection all those years ago where I went and met with a friend of mine, Zach Walker. I just turned up at his house and I was like, I've got this idea. We need a large speaker. We need a big piece of metal. And I just want to like perform through that. And we quite quickly started seeing that it was this just real-time generative representation of what I was doing. At first, it was very, very messy. But as each iteration came, we started to produce like very sort of technical, what looked like generative computer-based structures, but they were physical. And I love the fact that when you go deeper into the structure of sound, you see structures and forms that people associate aesthetically, to go back to our original conversation, with like as part of the digital archetype and sort of synthetic. But actually, like a lot of the industrial structures you see in architecture or in digital design, it's there in sound. Like there's these geometric Goliath infrastructures that are grids and straight lines, and which I just found so wonderful and interesting. So this visual research eventually went into generative systems and working with different engineers and coders to direct and create different sort of variables that produced outcomes based on voice. So before I talk about voice gems, there's a story that I always sort of share in my talks, which was a precursor to voice gems, which was another project with the Mill. And it was effectively a voice sculpture tool, digital voice sculpture tool, where we're able to use a microphone and we would have a visual representation like 2 stories high of someone's voice. And there was 500 individuals that came to the installation. One of those was a father with his daughter, and his daughter was just very young. I always say she was like a koala bear on his leg, very, very shy. And then when she walked up to the microphone and she made these tiny, small sounds, her tiny utterances became screaming and shouting and laughing when she saw the visual representation. So I saw that as an augmented relationship. The interactivity led to a new behavior, and it led to a shy young girl using her voice. And especially speaking about what we just said, that there's all this like reservation, but when you get that visual feedback of something massive, your voice can become massive, right? So that was like a sort of huge influential moment on why I make art. And I spent a couple years like writing up a form of like manifesto on the project, but I then developed a new system with my main partner on the project, Trong Bao, who's an incredible artist and dear. He's basically like family to me. But this system will produce a one-of-one a digital high-resolution gemstone from the features found in a human voice. And I mean, particle systems are like the starting point for a lot of like digital creation. But the emphasis on this project is the poetry. It's to represent voice as something very, very beautiful and precious, but also the fact that it becomes like a kind of tomb, a holder of someone's sentiment and voice. So the rules were locked in now like about 3.5 years ago, but like anyone who's listening, you would produce a unique structure in color and in form. And what we've been doing is basically building this large archive that we call the 1,000-year archive, which includes you, includes a lot of other figures from Jane Goodall to Philippe Pantone to Ai Weiwei, and also vocal phenomena. So we have endangered species, we have dying languages, but we've now also gone beyond to even having the voice of a tree, which was a hydrophone recording of the survivor tree, which was one of the first things to grow back after the Hiroshima bomb went off. So there's a kind of poetic interpretation of what a voice is, but it's a voice archive. And this archive exists as artifacts, and because they can be these kind of digital objects, they can also be physical objects. The stories held within them can behave in different ways. They can be kept, and that's a lifelong project. I'm going to continue to collect and preserve, and I want it to be like one of the most unique, wonderful showcases of not just voice, but humanity. And I have a vision that I would love to build like a Voice Gems cathedral-like structure, which has all of the stories. And I'm talking like years from now. But it's a wonderful project, just because I don't have one.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I don't have a voice gem.
Fascinating.
Yeah, because it's not about mine or Chung's voices. It's a project about celebrating the concept of voice in all of these different facets. And we get approached by individuals saying, we have this idea of what could be preserved, and they become a guest curator that will contribute to the archive, which mostly exists like online currently. But the unexpected part of the project is the kind of public response, which I've spoken to you a lot about over the years. And this project really evoked a kind of set of individuals that had lost loved ones, people that had voice note recordings of grandfathers, brothers, sisters who are no longer here. And some of the stories will have an email. There's a few that I have consent to sort of like talk about. But just to receive an email from a mother who just lost her son in a car crash, and she has this small recording of him laughing, which is to play that back on a device to kind of how do you serve that digital sort of data? Is there a way to respect how profound that is to a person by housing it in a work of art? And these individuals aren't so interested in, is it physical, is it digital? That breed of individuals that came towards us has a much more spiritual quality, where we're kind of giving a home to these audios that just give some solace and another place for that energy to go. And that wasn't expected. It wasn't something that we expected to happen. These individuals are not tech native. They're not crypto native. It's not like it's a kind of it's about individuals who have this emotional energy that they need to put somewhere. And it's interesting that an emerging tech project can sort of contribute. So the aim is to keep growing the archive, to showcase in large scale public exhibition, and just to really think about where that archive can go, and hopefully exist for a very, very long time.
There's something that's coming up for me that's like just the word synesthesia, where it seems that so much of your career up to this point and the way your career is oriented has followed this thread of, when we think of synesthesia, we're thinking of like seeing sounds, which what you're describing with Voice Gems, but you're also doing it at a level of like practice. Like there's a sort of synesthetic quality to your machine inspired voice. I don't know. Does that evoke anything for you?
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like, because you can be diagnosed, right? There's diagnosed like synesthesia, but conceptually and the way that I work, like I've never seen a difference between audio and visual. I mean, I see and hear the difference, but I think that like there is a possibility that a single compositional idea can be auditory. It can have a equal and opposite visual composition, but also that can be represented in haptics. Like there's a kind of all of these senses sit around the root concept of what that is, and when they all kind of push towards that equally, or at least in the same direction, I think experientially there's this other format of art experience, but it's not limited to music, visual art, or touch and sense. It's like they all add up to this perception. And for some reason, from a young age, like even as a teenager, I thought about that. I just really believed it. And voice is a cross-modal, high-dimensional thing, because yes, it's sound, but it's coming from this system of speech and communication. But there's such physicality. Like you perceive more through sort of physical sensation than you do from audio. But then audio is physical sensation. Like to hear something is just the perceptual echo of the vibrational source, which is movement, right? So it gets, I think it's a bit like a fractal. The the closer you look at it, you start realizing it's all just like one thing. And for some reason, that's always been very there for me. I see it all as one thing. So even though I personally wouldn't never label it as synesthetic, because I think it's nice when it comes from the outside in.
Yeah.
And when that happens, I'm like, absolutely. Like, it's one of my dreams to kind of attempt to think of what is a scientifically validated equivalent expression across many senses. Like, what does that even look like as a composition? But that's when we start getting a bit more like conceptual and avant-garde, which maybe is a rabbit hole we don't want to go down.
Well, actually, on the note of not just science, but thinking about the academic disciplines, what it's really making me think about, like, you've worked with neuroscientists, you've worked with phoneticians, you've worked with linguists, like, and this is, I'm realizing, like, maybe an extremely stupid question, but is there a field that specifically studies the voice? Like, there's audiology and there's ophthalmology, but is there a field that specifically studies the voice?
It's interesting because obviously, like what you mentioned there, that there's a lot of voice thinking, and within like extended techniques within music is established, but also like phenomenology, like thinking about this. I did an interview with a Max Planck Institute, which was just all, it was so interesting. I'd never really had an experience like that. But she was using a method of interview where she was trying to get me to articulate the systems and the things that happen before the sound is made, or the musical ideas even come. But then there was a lot of questions about, like, within that, about the physicality and about the expression. So all of those spaces do, in their own way, go very, very deep into voice per se. But there's more like holistic, all-encompassing potential sort of genome of what voice is, I don't think is really discussed a lot, where it's all under one umbrella and there's all these different factors and all these different contributions. Again, it's not my place to say if that's something that should exist or not, but it's definitely what my entire life is built around. Is that possibility, and that there's this map that I'm building, like, which we're kind of like meandering through in this conversation. Because like voice is both, like, because there's the inner voice. Like, for the audience that's listening, if I ask you to say like 1, 2, 3, you might say 1, 2, 3. But then if I say 1, 2, 3, but now just in your head, like, what is that? Like, like, what the hell is that voice? Where does it come from? Like, why does it sound like you? Does it need to sound like you? It could sound like anything. Why can't you do an impression with the voice in your mind? And I think it just reveals that there's an entire world of investigation in the absolute, it should be covered by now. The human voice just should be a complete sort of network of possibility that, there's like within phonetics, there's articulatory phonetics, which does include outside of language, like sound making and things like this. That should just be, there should be like in every textbook in the school, like a classic map where it's all done, everything, and it doesn't exist. Like the voice is still a final frontier of like possibility. So there's the external voice, but I think the same thing also applies to the inner voice and everything in between. There's this like, there's a kind of periodic table that exists out there that isn't there yet for all of the possible purpose and expression of external and internal voice and how they interact. But I don't sort of articulate that a lot, but that's what I'm moving between with all my projects and everything I think about. And it just should exist. Like the voice is the OG of all things, and predating music, predating language. And from like, there's this concept of old language where you have like crying, yawning, laughter. These are old vocal expressions that sit between like ritual, ceremony, language, and communication.
I mean, even you just saying yawning, my brain was like,
yeah. Well, there's one of my favorite clips is there's that viral video on the train of a guy laughing at a clip, and then after a period, the entire train is laughing just from like there's this kind of communal gaggling of like, that's very old. That, yeah. So I that map, those ideas, there's something in my spirit that just gets so like, I just feel so rooted and grounded when I think about these things.
It reminds me really quickly of the video, I believe it's from France, where they gathered like 15 people with really like distinct laughs. I mean, that is one of my all-time favorite videos. It's just exceptional.
It is, when we talk about vocal variation, like, oh my gosh, like the way some people laugh, because it's an unconscious process as well. It's like where that comes from, why that was beneficial evolutionary to develop these like variations in like laughter. It's an amazing clip for anyone who hasn't seen it. Sophie Scott, who I mentioned before, she plays that a lot because she has an amazing TED talk on laughter. She's done a lot of study on laughter itself. But yeah, the variation in voice is like, it's definitely an evolutionary fascination.
Well, one thing it's also making me think about is there's this idea in evolutionary biology. I mean, I think that's where it comes from, or evolutionary psychology, called exaptation, which you're probably familiar with, but just for those who aren't, it's when we evolve a behavior that is not the reason we evolved the biological feature. So one example might be like your tongue didn't evolve to shape language because language wasn't predestined in our evolution, but it became something that we exapted to use in this particular way. So it strikes me, like thinking about this, that you have the kind of like core unit of voice, which is like the ability to make these sounds, from which we then exapted the ability to shape that into more specific forms of speech. Like inevitably there must have been some evolutionary communicative purpose to it. You know, the kind of classic like danger, like the call of danger, whatever, like the sort of pre-verbal types of things. But as you're getting at, also there's also these other weird things that we don't really understand necessarily why we evolved. Then we can make guesses like laughter and yawns and stuff like that. But so there's sort of like, not to sort of overgeneralize here, but there's kind of like two big buckets here that we know so little about. It's like we know so little about the pre-verbal voice and the kind of like evolutionary pressures that maybe shaped that at individual and collective levels. But then there's also, when you're talking about the inner voice, there's also the whole question of like, well, what happens when that thing has been exapted and is like connected to some other aspect in our brains that makes us want to like convey meaning and like get to the point where we're like, you know, using symbolic communication, which is one of the things that purportedly like humans uniquely do, or do at the, you know, highest levels of complexity.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's like, it's a profoundly complex, and I think no one person can kind of know where the evolutionary process begins in voice, and it's this kind of more liminal in between where there's like mutational exploration for that can find value, but the voice has changed quite quickly, I believe. This is only anecdotal from echoes of what I remember from Sophie Scott, but she talks about, like, exactly as you said, like the shape of the tongue changing, allowing for speech, and line in the sand. This is more my own sort of anecdotal thinking, but it's just fascinating where you might, like talent, right? The ability to articulate and express or sing, you could argue people find that as an attractive feature. And it sometimes can supersede like traditional notions of attraction, which could be like physical prowess or like, so if you kind of think about that as like a phenomena, like what's really happening there, but it just shows you that like the ability to articulate, control, and sensorial experience, ability to create interesting experiences and use voice or other things in other way can lead to kind of procreation, right? So that has an interesting sentiment that like aesthetic, performative, experiential control kind of introducing itself alongside just like practical hunter-gatherer being able to like protect and serve. There's this interesting liminal like in between, which who knows when those things started, but I think there's a lot of signs in voice that there's these echoes of these profoundly old communal things like the laughter, shared laughter. One of my favorite quotes is like, laughter is the closest space between two people. But when you see those communal laughter or communal voice, like there's a reason why so much ritual and ceremony around the world is communal voice. Like there's something that there's tells in that, which I like to explore as well.
It also is sort of tying together for me this voice gem you did of the tree, of the Hiroshima tree, where are you currently thinking more around like, and because the example with, evolutionary fitness and maybe voice being something that gave a particular person or people across time evolutionary fitness, like thinking about birdsong, and like that's at least the model that comes to mind for me is like inevitably there's probably lots of critters all around the world who use their voices as a more predominant form of staying alive. And so how are you thinking now, or are you thinking now about any other species' voice in your work?
I've always been fascinated by like courting systems with birds of paradise, because like there's birds like the lyrebird, which some people might have seen some of the famous clips where they clear a space and they will obviously, not obviously, but they have one of the most complex bird songs on earth, like their own song. But they will pick and choose sounds of certain aesthetics and other bird songs and mimic it, and also innovate. And the idea is like basically that system of like sound making is it's absolutely essential for their procreation. Like, and the way they make their choices and the control. But what's really bizarre is they've effectively evolved to go beyond. It's no longer sort of voice or bird song. They're able to imitate like a recorder. They can do like chainsaws and machine-based like sounds, car alarms, cameras clicking in the pursuit of finding a mate, because they're all trying to outdo each other. They're trying to level up. They're trying to grow their sonic vocabulary. And I think it's so interesting how display and courting somehow has a connection to their genetics. Like the more advanced the song is, the more sort of impressive they're able to be as like a performer. It's a signal for them having better young. So there is a connection between quote unquote talent and inner workings. And in terms of just like musically, I think the rhythms within birdsong is really fascinating. I actually did a piece a few years ago where I took some lyrebird recordings and then basically tried to overlay percussion and sounds at the same rhythms as birdsong. Again, like interested in outside of the perspective. But the main thing is like voice in the animal kingdom is such a remarkable part. There's like, I believe it's called like a biosonosphere, which is like the sonic soundscape. And within the Congo, as the temperature changes, animals know their sort of radio slot for where their vocals will travel most. So sound travels further in the cold. So in colder temperatures, there are lower frequency beings that will take advantage of that, because lower frequencies have a wider wavelength, but they don't always travel as well. And then, there's this sort of intuitive radio station of sharing voice, and I think it's just stunning. So human or animal or phenomena. I just think like the concept of voice is interesting, and then you have ideas of like speculative voice. Like, what is a voice? What does it mean to have a voice? What does it mean to feel heard having a voice? This is all part of that map that I've mentioned.
What do you make of a voice that has no sonic component?
Yeah, I mean, I think like this idea of paralanguage that I mentioned before, which is this meta identity, signifiers of identity that aren't semantic, doesn't have to be like language. That also applies to body language. I think someone's voice can be how they move, how they tilt their head. I think musical voicing, right? The way somebody adds attack and release on how they play percussion. The way someone plays chess is a voice, like their specific style, their contributions. I still like watch some of my father passed away a couple of years ago, but me and him playing chess is like a very, very important thing to me. But on some of the online platforms, I can still go on and like go through his games, and I feel like I'm seeing his like voice like through that. His like seeing his decisions and his mistakes and his like his good moves. So I think there is this kind of poetic part of how you can interpret a voice. And there are individuals that have literally lost their voice. Like done quite a bit of work with the Shout at Cancer Choir, which are all individuals that have had laryngectomies. They've had their voice boxes taken out. So they've all found different ways of making vocal tones. Some could be quite extreme, others are like what you'd expect. But they've had to reimagine their voice. They've had to re-identify. So voice is, I think voice is life force itself, however it might exude from the being. But there's also interesting concepts of, say, Vipassana, which is the silence, the absence of voice, can be an amplifier of one's voice, like one's self. So I can bore everyone for many more hours talking about all these things, but it's my life's work, and I think I love to get into the more esoteric, sort of spiritual, practical, general concepts around people, which is one head, and then there's this other head, which is I'm a complete obsessive practitioner of what I can achieve. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. And it feels like a perfect place to segue to, I have 3 questions I like to ask every guest at the end of the episode. You've inevitably answered these to some extent already, so feel free to call that stuff back in. Feel free to take it totally different direction. The first is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I mean, the easy thing is to say their voices. I think people should pay more attention to their nervous systems, and what is a reaction and what is a response. And I think that can really apply to your practice. And I think there is an authentic voice, there's an authentic purpose and drive into how you make choices for how you spend your time. But I think like your nervous system and your body has all these signals, whether it's voice or something else, that certain things feel great when you're in them and you're flowing in them. And I think we shouldn't let anything tell us that we shouldn't be in that space as much as possible. I'll leave that point there.
Love it. What is one resource that you would recommend or that you use for making better sense of reality?
There's a Bertrand Russell book, which I think is it's like the individual and the collective, which is just a really interesting like take on individualistic and collective like thinking. And that book just really inspired me between like maybe what are your subjective pursuits, and then what is an attempt at some form of objective largeness. And that's been like a really great sort of guiding light. But the other thing I would say is silence. I think stop sometimes, because there's all of these like ancient lessons bouncing around in the kind of darkness behind your eyes that I think can be a resource at any time. And I mean, I say that with this profundity, but I'm terrible at it. But when I do, as an ADD individual who has been obsessed with stimulation and like dopamine my whole life, I think there is an abundance in the lesser than, in the silence, in the stopping, which I'm only really discovering over the last couple of years. So silence as an abundance, I think, is another resource.
Amazing. And finally, you referenced interruption versus disruption earlier, which teased this up, which is, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Wow. I mean, because it's you, I'll answer this really authentically. I know these might be supposed to be short answers, but
no, not at all.
So my father, I know that you're close to your father as well, and like my father is still my best friend, my hero, inspirer, wonderful human, wonderful man, who gave me the sort of gift of being passionate about creativity. And I cared for him for about 2 years before he passed. And sorry, everyone, this is quite like heavy, but it is my real like answer to the question. Like grief is losing someone is obviously such a harrowing, like difficult thing. but I couldn't have been closer to that human being or had more admiration, and to kind of care for and see that person out the gate, to be with them as intimately as I can to the very edge of reality, and they keep going and I can't kind of like go with them. That will shift your perspective on all things. And I think the main, without kind of pontificating and going too much into all that, I think some of the hardest things that we experience interrupt, or in some cases disrupt, what we think is. And I think part of being human is to have that questioned. And when it's shattered sometimes, all of this new light can come in. And there's the possibility of new habits, new vulnerabilities, new weaknesses. And I think life is more about like pliancy and vulnerability and possibility and eros than it is about strength and definition. So that is what I took from that, and in a kind of paradoxical way, it made me more defined in many ways, but it also opened me up to a whole new set of possibilities, and I'm grateful for it. And everybody has their time. He was 83, so he had a good time. He was 23 till he was 82. That's what I like to say. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. All right. This has been, I should say, it's like, I want to say it's been as wide ranging of a conversation I expected, but of course it's vaster even than that. So thank you for taking the time. Is there anything that we didn't get to that is like coming up for you, or that you feel like fits in with everything we talked about that you'd be remiss not to mention?
I mean, there's always more, especially with you, Jesse. No, I think like it's just another kind of grandiose statement about just to the title of this like session. I do believe in the integration of art and technology as a fundamental part of knowledge sharing as we move forward, and that being experiential with knowledge, it really kind of overcomes this dopamine inflation that we're up against, where like people just need so much more to pay deep attention to anything. So I think the experimental world has the ability to partner with global problem solving stages and people with the best ideas to just help the world turn their head for at least 3 seconds to maybe open up to something new. And that's really what all my work is about, whether it's an exhibition, a talk, a partnership, or research. Is I'm just hoping that I can create some headspace in people to take on new ideas. And I think that's enough pontificating from me.
No pontificating. And you've definitely had that impact on my life. And so, yeah, again, thanks for taking the time. This has been a blast.
My absolute pleasure. Anytime, Jesse. So I'm so grateful for our chats. And to anyone else that actually listened to that very divergent, neurodivergent, non-linear shared, structured beautifully by Jesse. So, yeah, very grateful to be here.
Amazing. This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.